I'm very happy you bring up the question of forgiveness in relationship to blessing, because I'd like to remind those who are listening that it is through blessing that I was healed of one of the major resentments in my life. Maybe I can tell the story. This is how I discovered blessing. I was working for a small non-governmental organization in Switzerland when I came back from Africa in the early 80s. And I was asked to set up a program for schools on North-South relations. There was very little going on in schools. That was the early 80s, practically nothing. And so I took out this job with great enthusiasm. I was so enthusiastic, I even had a camp bed in my office. And when I missed the last train home, I would sleep at the office. And at one point I decided I wanted to do a roving exhibit for schools on the theme of world hunger, which is still one of the huge issues today. Close to 900 million people still go to bed hungry every night. And there was no money in the budget for doing this roving exhibit. My sponsors said, "Sorry, Pierre, we don't have a penny left in the budget. You have to do without your exhibit." And I was so keen on doing this that I took out of my own savings. At the time, it was about 13,000 Swiss francs, which would be at least $25,000 today, or about the equivalent in euros. It was a very large sum. And the exhibit worked very well and was spoken of on the radio, in the newspapers. And the title of the exhibit was called, the roving exhibit was called Ending Hunger Today. And just at that time I discovered something called the Hunger Project, which is a worldwide campaign which started in the States in the 70s to end hunger, or rather to impress politicians with the urgency of ending hunger in the world today. And I joined this campaign, and I was a simple volunteer in this campaign. And the slogan of the campaign was ending hunger by the year 2000. And my sponsors, these non-governmental organizations, were slightly leftish, and they didn't very much like what came from the United States. And they didn't like the methods of the Hunger Project. So they forbid me to speak of this world campaign to end hunger when I spoke about ending hunger in schools, where I showed this roving exhibit called Ending Hunger Today. It was such a total contradiction. And these were organizations which in the field were attempting to end hunger. And there was one gentleman in these four organizations who was a militant atheist and just couldn't bear me. And he decided he wanted to get rid of me. And he managed to convince his colleagues that this would be a good thing. And they convened a meeting. There were no minutes taken of the meeting, nothing. And I was told, I'd already been told to stop speaking in schools of this world campaign. But I continued using the slogan, the end of hunger for the year 2000, because I've lived 11 years in Africa. I was one of the founding members in the 70s, what became the largest grassroots peasant farmer organization of the whole African continent, the 6S organization in Burkina Faso. And one of our member organizations had this very same slogan, the end of hunger by the year 2000. So I thought, if that's good enough for the African farmers, it's good enough for me to use in schools. And so I was convened to this meeting and told either you stop saying we can end hunger by the year 2000 because the Hunger Project says this, or you quit your work. I mean, this is unbelievable. Here are organizations fighting hunger telling me to stop speaking of the end of hunger. It was just totally nonsensical. And later I learned that they'd schemed that if I was put in front of this alternative, I would quit my job. So it was a whole setup, and as I didn't want to commit a moral harakiri against my own convictions, I quit my job. And that's just what they'd counted upon. And in the following weeks, I developed the most huge resentment towards these organizations, especially the gentleman who'd organized the whole thing. And it became an obsession. I would think of nothing else from morning till evening. And I did all the meditating, chanting mantras, reading, praying, everything. Nothing happened. And I was miserable because I knew I was harming myself by holding this resentment, but it felt as if the resentment was holding on to me. And one day, reading the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus, the sentence, "Bless those who curse you." Well, of course, Pierre, it's so simple. All I have to do is bless them. And then and there, at that very minute, I started blessing the people concerned in their joy, in their peace, in their abundance, in their health, in their relationships, their family life, in every conceivable way. And first, it was in the mind, out of obedience to what I felt was a revealed commandment. But very soon it moved down to the heart, because blessing is 100% heart energy. And suddenly, a few months later, I started blessing people in the street, in the public transport, on the train, at the post office, the supermarket, everywhere. And it was so joyful. I took the train quite often, and I'd go the whole length of the train in both directions, just to be sure not to miss anyone on that train, not miss blessing anyone on that train. And I started having amazing experiences where people changed like that, their attitude, just because I'd started blessing them. For instance, I remember I'd organized a large concert with an African friend in a big hall in Geneva, in a very large college. It was a benefit concert for this peasant organization in Senegal, which had the slogan, "The End of Hunger by the year 2000." And it had been announced on the radio, in the newspapers. But the technician in charge of the hall wanted nothing to do with our concert. And the director of the college, where the hall was situated, told me, "Look, Mr. Pradervand, I'm sorry, but he's a civil servant. I can't force him to work after working hours. You'll have to find someone else." Well, we did, and it cost us quite a lot of money. And I arrived 2 hours before the concert with my Cameroonian friend, who is the founder of this little African Caribbean orchestra. And there were only 2 mics on the scene. And he said, "Pierre, look, I'm sorry, I can't have a 12-man show with musicians and singers and 2 mics." So we went to the technician of the college, the one who was hostile, and we started asking for explanations. And at the first he was extremely hostile. And I felt, the anger starting to churn in my stomach. And my little voice said, "Look, Pierre, you're not going to resolve the situation by getting angry. Just start blessing him." And I just blessed this man in his peace, his serenity, his joy, his cooperation, in everything that came up. And in between 2 sentences, a large smile appeared on his face. He went to his laboratory, came back with a whole pile of mics, recommended the best ones, and wished us a wonderful evening. And I could tell you story after story of this type. And if those who are listening to this little video go on the blessing website, gentleartofblessing.org. I repeat, gentleartofblessing, all linked.org. They will find a whole section on healings through blessing. So, and it continued. Sometime later, I was writing a talk I'd been asked to give on healing the world for an international youth meeting in Zurich. And while I was writing my talk, suddenly I received this incredible gust of inspiration, and out came the one-page text, The Gentle Art of Blessing, which you will find on the website. As a matter of fact, there's a very, very beautiful video by Jane Young, who's the webmaster of the site, on the text, The Gentle Art of Blessing. But the most wonderful thing is that it took me 3 years of blessing to get completely rid of animosity towards the gentleman who'd organized this whole thing. But 10 years later, I met this gentleman in Lausanne at a meeting, and I felt one of the most incredible bursts of joy of my whole life. I felt like taking this gentleman in my arms and hugging him and kissing him, and we had dinner together, and for days afterwards my heart continued ringing with joy. And it took me 10 more years to understand why this has happened. And because there's a paragraph in the text which says, if something unexpected knocks down your plans, burst into blessing. And certainly my plans had been knocked down by my employers, and I learnt blessing. Because, and the text continues, what you feel so unwanted, you have called upon yourself. And I believe now that I have passed what one calls a soul contract with this gentleman, this man who gave me the sack, if I can say. I believe that before coming on earth, he and I made a contract so that through this experience, I would discover the power of blessing, which since has enriched hundreds of thousands of lives around the world. So, just a way of saying that, another way of saying that I think our lives are absolutely perfect. Despite all the appearances to the contrary, what happens to us is just what we need to happen, to learn the lessons we need to learn. And some years ago, I went through a terrible crisis. I call it my tsunami. Everything in my life fell through. An extraordinary marriage of 26 years. I had the greatest health challenge in my whole lifetime. Because my energy dropped, my workshops fell to pieces, hence my finances fell to pieces. But above all, my spiritual path of over 35 years exploded to smithereens. Now, just one of these challenges would be quite something, but the 5 at the same time, it was absolute hell. And for 3 years, I was in the valley of the shadow of death. In the spiritual literature, one speaks a lot about the dark night of the soul. And I guess that was my dark night of the soul. And today, 6 years later, I can say that I'm grateful for that experience, for that tsunami, because I was on a spiritual path which was just absolutely no longer adequate for me. It was very, very narrow. It was closed to any contact with other systems of belief. And I really needed a Hiroshima to get me out of that. So I had my Hiroshima, my tsunami. And today I can really say thank you.